Lloyd, great to be back in the studio again. I'm very excited about today's guest. We've got Mike Mortlock in from MCG Quantity Surveyors. He's here with us today in the studio.
Great to be with you again, Armando. And everyone listening to us should know who Mike is. And we're very excited to have you with us today, Mike. And we're looking very forward to having a chat with you.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to the chat.
Mike, we always like to start off with just knowing a little bit more of your background. So could you go through where you grow up and what got you into property?
That's a sort of difficult question to answer because I bounced around a little bit. It's like my father should have been in the army or something. That would be an easier story to explain. But I was born in Penrith and left when I was 2, not by myself, obviously, had some help. Moved to a little country town called Yerong Creek, which is about half an hour outside of Wagga Wagga. And I can remember being elected Year 6 school captain, but I like to say never served a day in office because I moved to Griffith in New South Wales, the Murrumbidgee irrigation area. And then in 1997 sort of came to the greater Lake Macquarie area. So I've been a Novocastrian ever since, but it's not really enough for Novocastrians unless your sort of afterbirth hits the floor of the John Hunter Hospital. You don't really count. So I don't know where I can say I'm from. All around.
And what sort of education did you get? Did you go to university, or how did you get on this property journey? So it must have started somewhere.
Yeah, well, I didn't go to university straight out of high school. I had an immune deficiency, so I ended up doing year 11 and 12 over 3 years, and then basically got a job in the property world and started university a couple of years later. So all I really ever wanted to do was to be a fighter pilot, but I had health issues that kind of destroyed that dream. And yeah, started studying real estate. So that was back when it was kind of like a year full time of study. These days, I think you can get a certificate in an afternoon. Realised that real estate was not the perfect vocation for an introverted chappy, and studied valuation because I liked property, but I liked more the analytics rather than the selling side of things, and then got a job working for a quantity surveying firm and was convinced to sort of move the credits over to a Bachelor of Construction Management, and then started my own business in 2011. It's a bit of a weird thing when people ask me what I do and I say quantity surveyor, they basically say it back to me as a way of saying, what the hell is that?
Explain to our listeners, what is that?
Well, if I want to sound fancy, Armando, I call myself a construction cost economist because that makes me sound extra
fancy.
Special. It does sound good, doesn't it?
It does.
But essentially, a quantity surveyor is the best qualified person to estimate construction costs. And you can probably think of a million different reasons why you might want to know how much something cost. My area of specialisation and expertise is in tax depreciation. So we need to estimate the construction cost of investment properties for property owners so that we can work out the decline in value for tax purposes. We also do it for insurance replacement cost reports, so you know how much to insure your house for if it was destroyed or damaged, all the way through to feasibility financier reports for banks and expert witness, and there's quite a lot to quantity surveying.
Can you explain to us a little bit the different types of methods that you use where you're preparing one of those reports?
Yeah, look, there's not sort of methods in the way that a valuer would talk about things like summation and capitalisation and comparative market value style analysis. But there's two main accepted methods of depreciation under the Uniform Capital Allowances, which comes from the Income Tax Assessment Act of 1997. I'm just giving you some examples about why I don't get invited to barbecues by rattling off tax legislation. But we have the diminishing value and the prime cost method. So these are the two accepted ATO methods to calculate the decline in value of assets. The diminishing method, as it sounds, sort of starts higher and declines over time. The prime cost is more of a flat rate that starts out lower but just sort of stays uniform. And the crossover period is around about 7 years. But once you go into sort of commercial property and small business, there's simplified tax systems rather than the uniform capital allowances. So there's a few different ways you can slice and dice things depending on whether it's residential or commercial. But I like to say I've dedicated my life to understanding this world so you don't have to, dear listener, because you've got your whole life ahead of you. You don't want to waste time looking up commercial tax legislation.
Absolutely. And out of those methods, is there a preferred one that a lot of people use in terms of like when they're looking at getting their investment properties done for their accountant?
Yeah. Yeah, look, if we look at diminishing value and prime cost, we have to be registered tax agents to do what we do, but we're not accountants, and actually sort of suggesting a method is considered accounting advice that we're not qualified to say. So we can't sort of guide someone, but we can say, well, what are the benefits for the diminishing value versus the prime cost? And anecdotally, commercial property owners typically will use the prime cost rather than the diminishing value, and private, let's say mum and dad investors, will typically use the diminishing value method. Now, the legislation change that we saw on the 9th of May 2017 really kind of changed how diminishing value differentiates from prime cost. So on the 9th of May, that was our esteemed Treasurer, Mr. Morrison, who went on to be Prime Minister and then try and put out some bushfires from his Hawaii satellite office and many other famous things that he got up to. So what he did is he said that you could only claim plant and equipment deductions if you either buy a brand new property after that date or you put brand new assets in. So the diminishing value and the prime cost really only kind of matters when you're talking about plant and equipment. So if you think about a house, most of the value is Division 43 or the construction component, which is things like bricks, it's things like timber, gyprock, the frame, the roof, concrete, those sorts of things. Plant and equipment's the loose assets like carpets, blinds, and kitchen appliances. So when you have, let's say, a brand new property today and you have all those plant and equipment items, say carpet will depreciate at 25%, whereas, say, tile, which is considered part of the structure, at 2.5%. So there's a 10x difference in whether it's carpet or tile from a depreciation point of view. But if you buy a second-hand property, you can't claim the carpet anyway. You'd be much better off with tiles because it's part of the base structure. But typically, to try and answer as briefly as I can, the diminishing value gives you more deductions over the first part of ownership. So typically 5 to 7 years, it's going to give you higher deductions than the prime cost. To give you an example, say carpet has a 25% rate under the diminishing value method, but the way to do it for prime cost, it's 100 divided by the effective life. So I think that gives you a 16 and 2/3 depreciation rate. But it'll be 16 and 2/3 of the opening value each financial year for 40 years, whereas the diminishing value method, it'll be 25% of the opening value year one. But then in year two, it's like, okay, well, the original costs were this minus what we claimed in year one, then we apply that 25% for the year two claim. So it does sort of drop over time. But once you select one method, you need to stick with it. So I've had accountants ask me in the past, well, why would you not want to get the maximum deductions today if they're available? And the only example I can think of was, let's say you're a Subway sandwich artist on $50,000 a year, but you are studying to be a brain surgeon. The higher deductions are actually better for you when you're on a higher rate of tax. So that's the only example I could think where prime costs would be beneficial to an investor. But for everyone else, the best time to get the deductions is today, because the time value of money diminishes over time, especially in high interest rate environments like we are now.
If we could use an example for our listeners out there, their mum and dad might have a 2-bedroom unit which they've bought relatively new, somewhere around 700,000. They would obviously benefit greatly from a depreciation schedule. What sort of numbers would they be looking at?
Yeah, look, I hate to be this person, but I need to put my little asterisk to say it really depends on how big it is, where it is around the country, the standard of finish and those sorts of things. But let's say a second-hand property that's a couple of years old, you'd probably be thinking maybe $6,000 or $8,000 worth of depreciation deductions each year for 40 years from the date of construction. But if it is a second-hand property, you won't get the plant and equipment items. Whereas if it did have plant and equipment, you might be sort of thinking around that sort of $12,000 to $14,000 mark.
So that's a good deduction, of an $8,000 deduction. I know this is only an estimate, but that's a fair deduction that a lot of people probably are not claiming at the moment.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. The last time I crunched the numbers, I looked at 1,000 residential transactions to try and figure out the percentage of people that were missing out on deductions. So, of course, I don't have the data on what people are out there that don't claim. We can only look at the ones that come through our business. And what we found was that 6.7% of those 1,000 people actually waited so long that they missed out on deductions. So you can actually back claim 2 financial years worth of data. So 6.7% of those people waited more than 2 years, so they would have missed claims. Now, the average amount that they...
Just go over that again, Mike. So you're saying people, if they haven't done the depreciation schedule, they can go back 2 years and still get it done and claim the deduction?
Yeah, absolutely. So your accountant may charge a fee to amend your previous year's claims, but in that data sample, we found the average amount of missed claims was $20,537. Now, that's something that just lives rent-free in my brain because it's something that keeps me up nights. I don't like the idea of investors paying more tax than they need to. And if you extrapolate that across the investor population, so 20,537 times by 6.7% of the investor pool, it worked out to be $2.88 billion worth of deductions floating in the ether.
Wow.
So that's kind of part of my personal mission is to reduce that number because that is an entitlement the investors are able to claim as the cost of running their business as a property investor.
And this is one of the things you talk about in your book, Lloyd, isn't it? That you part of your dream team should be...
Absolutely. So in Possibly Geared, I've got a chapter 11 dedicated to the dream team, and part of the dream team is having a quantity surveyor there. So I talk in depth about that, and through Oz Property Professionals, we recommend everyone has a quantity surveyor on their team, and as our listeners know, we refer to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about how our listeners can benefit a little bit more from engaging your services or that of a quantity surveyor sort of straight away after they've bought the property rather than waiting?
Yeah, look, people do often ask, well, when do I need to get it done? And the reality is you only really need it done by the time you're meeting with your accountant to work out what your tax position is for that financial year. But by virtue of the fact that we found 6.7% that of people that miss out on deductions, we always encourage people to do it straight away just to make sure that that's a box that's ticked when they own that investment property. So really, the value of a depreciation schedule is that depreciation typically is the second biggest deduction for an investor after the interest component of their loan. So you're claiming your property management fees as a deduction, you're claiming your repairs and maintenance. There's a fairly strong argument to say that depreciation is bigger than both of those combined, depending on the property. So we definitely encourage people to do it. And at the end of the day, I don't want to launch into a sales pitch here, but...
you can a little bit, Mike. Go ahead.
Say again?
Go ahead.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's either going to put money back in your pocket or we're not going to do the report. So part of our first step is just to look at the property. Okay, well, what have you bought? How old is it? Have you made any improvements to it? Has the previous owner made any improvements to it? And we can come up with a bit of a desktop estimate to say, yes, this is a property that will stack or it won't. So thankfully, it's a pretty good product to sell because it's either going to give you more money than it costs, or we're not going to do it. And I'm not much of a salesperson, so it's just lucky that it's a product that really investors normally are going to need, and it's going to be beneficial for them.
Now, on that, do you just look at the over the computer, or do you actually visit the property, or a bit of both? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, look, that's become a real battleground within our industry. There's a few quantity surveyors saying that they can go and do a report on an established property without physically inspecting it, and the Australian Institute of Quantity Surveyors has issued a white paper saying that there are only very unusual examples of where an inspection might not be required. And a good example, apart from physically having already been to the property and being able to certify no one's made any improvements, is if you buy a brand new property and you have the exact construction costs, you have the full set of plans and the finishes or the documentation on the standard of finish and the types of appliances and things in there. But for everything else, we physically do need to go to site because we do need to measure the property, we need to take photos, and our guys are very keenly attuned to the history of the dwelling. I mean, even things like downpipes have fashion, right? So we can look at the colour of a downpipe and estimate within a fairly tight period of when that property would have been built. Little things like stainless steel appliances, they didn't really exist pre-2000. So there's all sorts of little clues. And I've personally been inside properties with owners and sort of said, oh, I can see that the property's been extended. And the owner's sort of saying, oh, how do you know that? And then you can look underneath the house and see the stairs going to the back door, or what was the back door but is now actually the middle of the lounge room. And it's a very untraditional way to enter a property is through the lounge room subfloor. So that's just part of the reason why we need to go and we need to assess what's happened to that property over time, because if the previous owner has made an improvement to that, then chances are you'll be able to claim on their blood, sweat and tears.
I'm glad you clarified that, because I have spoken to people within your profession who have said, no, they can just, you look at get an established property done without inspecting it. And I've never been able to work out how they could possibly do that. So it's good that you've actually clarified that for us.
Yeah, I'm really disappointed, to be honest, to hear that exists within our industry, and our industry body is trying to communicate that that's not best practice. And to be honest, it is very difficult for businesses like ours to maintain a national force to be able to inspect properties around this great big land that we have. Australia's a bloody big place, and it took starting a national quantity surveying firm to figure out exactly how big it is, right? So I'd love to think that we could do an online version and do away with that, but it's just not best practice. Yep. It's not going to be accepted by the tax office if it was to be audited, and the chances are you're just risking not getting the maximum deductions by not being able to see that this property has been improved. And I've had plenty of examples of properties that have actually been demolished, and people have done reports on the old property that doesn't exist anymore, because that's what's online. When you look at the photos, it's pretty terrible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with your report, is this something the investor needs to update every year, or is it one report that will last them for many years?
Yeah, that's a good question. Really, it's a 40-year report, so it starts from when you purchase, or let's say you build the property, it'll go for 40 years. If you're doing one or two improvements, we'll always update the report free of charge, and you can give that to your accountant as well. If you say, on this particular date, we spent this much money on this asset, they can include that in your tax return. What's different to us is that we're qualified to estimate construction costs, but the accountant isn't. But where the cost is known, they can apply the ATO effective lives to it. The only time that I would suggest that we need to update it is, let's say you've paid a builder or a renovation company, let's say $50 or $100 or $200,000 to undertake a renovation. That builder is not going to necessarily itemize each component in the way that would be maximized from a depreciation point of view. So we need to know, how much worth of carpet or blinds or ovens, cooktops, range hoods, hot water system, all of those sorts of things. And so if we know that you've spent $100K, we can't depreciate more than $100K, but what we can do is we can itemize those plant and equipment assets that depreciate at faster rates. So you're getting more of the deductions up front rather than having to wait for 40 years. And as you can imagine, I'm probably old enough to remember going to the shops with 50 cents and getting a whole bag of lollies as a kid, right? 50 cents doesn't get you much anymore, and that's just the time value of money. Getting the deductions today rather than waiting 40 years is a much better way to do it. And I think as property investors, the hardest time to hold on to an investment property is at the beginning, because over time you might pay down some principal, but even if you just stick with interest only, the rents should grow over time. So you really kind of want to get those deductions as soon as you can as an investor.
Just a little scenario for you. If someone comes along and they've bought a property that may be 50 years old, it's all in the original condition, can't really depreciate anything there. Do you offer a scenario where you might say, well, you need to do a renovation, and then can anything be done, depreciating it from then? What sort of advice would you give to someone in that scenario?
Yeah, look, I think it comes back to, for me, like, whilst depreciation is my bread and butter and it's the world that I've inhabited for many, many years, depreciation is a bonus rather than a strategy. So people ask me all the time, Mike, what should I buy for maximum deductions? And it's normally a one-bedroom apartment in a complex of 500 with 3 swimming pools, a gym and 8 levels of basement parking. And when I sort of say that to them as a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing, they sort of say to me, well, isn't that a bad investment investment? And I say, yeah, it's probably a terrible one, and the strata fees will put hairs on your hair, right? But in that sort of situation, we wouldn't necessarily recommend, well, you need to do a renovation for the deductions. Just because there's no depreciation available doesn't mean it's a good investment property. So if people are thinking about a renovation, we can give them an idea about what the potential after-tax sort of position would be on those improvements. But yeah, certainly we do see properties that are built in the 50s and 60s and have had nothing done. But it's not as common as people would think. If you think about an unrenovated property that's built prior to the cut-off date for depreciation on the original building structure, which is 1987, it's not putting the best foot forward in terms of, let's say, revaluing the property to pull out equity or attracting the best quality of tenant or attracting the best deductions. So we do generally find, in fact, our data says 69.9% of properties that are built prior to 1987 have had some renovations done. And often it might not seem particularly obvious to the owner, but that's sort of part of the process. But we do sometimes, Lloyd, look at these original properties and say, look, there's no value in a depreciation schedule for this one. Or we might say, look, we can see about $400 a year. That's not really going to pay for the report within the first full financial year, but your accountant might sort of say, well, because of your strategy or your high rate of tax or the fact that you've already owned it for 2 years or you're definitely going to rent it for another 10, it still might be worthwhile. But we leave that up to the accountant.
Okay, and with your company, MCG Quantity Surveyors, are you Australia-wide now? Have you got offices everywhere that our listeners can call in and get this depreciation schedule done?
Yeah, absolutely, we do. So we've just got a 1300 number for the nation they can call into. We don't have offices in every state, but we service every state around the country. So yeah, we're proudly national, despite the difficulties of maintaining a workforce around the country. I would rather do something else than do something that I believe is substandard or not the best that we can do. So yeah, it's really important for us to be out there and physically inspecting these properties.
Sure. And just one other question. I know Lloyd talks about the dream team and adding value to a home. So we might have a listener that'll go out there, buy a home, do a renovation to add some value. When should they be calling you? Should they be calling you just before when they buy the property, or do you think they should do that renovation and then call you in for that report?
I think it's a good idea to get in touch with us at the beginning, because we want to kind of see, is there anything in the original property that would attract some deductions? And it depends on how much they're going to spend and what is kind of the scope of works, because we can assist them with tender reviews from a construction estimating point of view if it's a big project. In certain states around the country, like New South Wales, if you're improving a property over a certain value, you actually need a quantity surveyor to sign off on the development application. Otherwise, the local council would normally be told, oh yeah, I'm doing a reno and I'm going to spend about 20 grand because the fees are on a sliding scale. And then they ask them, oh, what are you going to do? Oh, another story. And they're like, yeah, that's not happening for 20 grand. So we help out with those sorts of things. But it just depends on how big it is. But ideally we'd have the chat beforehand. And sometimes there's guidance that we can provide about what sort of assets to put as part of the renovation. For example, I mentioned carpet before. Having an 8-year effective life gives it a 25% depreciation rate in the diminishing value method compared to 2.5% for things like polished concrete or let's say tiles, for example. I mean, I've gone so far as to say people should tile their kitchens to maximise their deductions, but that's yet to take off as a fashion, and probably for good reason.
So putting that quantity surveying aside for a minute, do you do other sort of things in property? Do you have some properties yourself in your portfolio?
Yeah, I tend not to sort of talk too much about myself in that regard. I'm normally on the receiving end of all the juicy tax questions, but yeah, I've been investing for quite some time in property. I'm probably a better quantity surveyor than I am investor. But yeah, I've got a handful of properties and certainly very active in that space as an advocate for property investing in general, and try and keep abreast of the market and seeing what's happening.
Yep, that sounds good. Really keen to understand a little bit more about what your first job was. You mentioned you had a job in property and it wasn't quite for you. So what was your very first job?
My very first ever job was probably picking up manure for fertilizing for about, I think it was either $2 a bag for a next door neighbor. He recruited me into that. And then I think at the age of 9, my mother took me to the local council to get a busking license. I used to sing for my supper and play guitar on the street. And I remember having a little Excel spreadsheet where I worked out my hourly rate was more than my old man's. And I told him that very proudly. And I think he told me to go into another room with rather fragrant language. Look, I did have an illustrious, I think about a 10-month career as a residential sales agent in property. And as I mentioned, I am an introvert and was much sort of quiet and shy than I am these days, because I have to do quite a lot of media and podcasting and those sorts of things, and it just kind of wasn't for me. But I did love property, and I did love property analytics, and I went on to study quite a bit in the property space. But yeah, it's just funny where you end up sometimes.
And what did you learn along the way? Because obviously you've worked in real estate for a little while. You've seen many, many homes being a quantity surveyor. So did that influence the way you purchase property?
Yeah, well, probably the first sort of influence that my studies made on my own investing journey is I bought a property that was a 2-bed that had 2 living spaces, with the idea that I could quickly convert that. And it was sort of drawing on my valuation studies, where I was looking at, well, what are the sales comparables for 3 bedrooms in my area compared to 2 bedrooms, and what would be the cost to do this conversion. So that was probably the first time that I looked at something, and that's something that I suppose I keep in mind. I mean, valuers talk about a highest and best use concept for a parcel of land. That's kind of always in my mind, and looking at, what are the comparables for this property, and are there ways that I can add equity very, very quickly? I think outside of that, just in seeing so many transactions and being in the space for so long, I've come up with a bit of a notion about property and eating your veggies. I don't know if you guys grew up the same as me, but dessert was always contingent on eating your veggies, right? So totally. You can have your cakes or your desserts or your ice cream, but you got to eat your veggies first. And the metaphor that I came up with there is that the actual kind of plan for your property portfolio and your investing is the vegetables, and the dessert is the hot spot. And I think as investors, we talk so much about where's the next Perth or which place is going to boom, but we don't necessarily consider, okay, well, I'm 20 years old, or I'm 60 years old, or my borrowing capacity is X or it's Y, or I want my passive income to be like this, or when I turn 50, I want to retire and I want to sail around the world. I want a modest little property, or I want to designer handbags and private jets. I think all this comes before that hotspot, and I think the data still says that 72% of investors only ever get one property, and I think that's because they're not eating those vegetables. They're not looking at what is the overall plan, and rather just getting sucked into the boundless commentary about this place is going to boom, or this is the type of investment that you should buy. And I'm sure that, Lloyd, you would probably agree, it would be nice to have your customers or your clients unplugged from the media for a point in time, because it can be very unhelpful and misleading.
Totally true, Mark. And I spend a lot of time trying to educate our clients on that. And that's why we map out a strategy for them and discuss a plan, because talking about hotspots really just doesn't work. And there's so much hype. And like you mentioned, Perth, and there's obviously other areas. And for me, it's about getting a good asset. Now, whether some people talk about blue chip assets, but some people say that's in a capital city. That's fine, but not everybody can afford that. You can get a good regional property investment as well, but it's got to be in a good proven area, and you've got to look at what you're trying to achieve long term, and the growth of that asset over the long term, and how that's going to get you into your next investment. When I look at these statistics of some of these hotspots, they've had negative growth over a lot of those years. So I think a lot of the commentary around come from people that haven't been in the market for very long. So people can get very excited over an area that's really booming at the moment. But if they've only been around for 5 minutes or 5 years, they don't really have that experience. You need to kind of been around and seen several growth cycles. And I always say that a growth cycle, like a market cycle, goes for sort of anywhere from 7 to 13 years, really. So you need to see how the market's sort of gone, over sort of a 20, 25-year period to really understand, what markets are going to perform well for you and whether that actually suits your portfolio over the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. And I think given that I'm talking to Mr. Positively Geared, we need to understand that property investors often are looking to build a reasonable portfolio. Their goal isn't necessarily to own that one property. So at some point it becomes a game of finance. So you actually need to kind of strategize to say, all right, well, if I want to buy my third, fourth, fifth and sixth, I need to look at, well, how much am I earning? What is my actual cash flow position? And sometimes your portfolio will dictate which type of property is actually the most advantageous for you at a particular point in time. But without doing that strategy piece, you are just kind of throwing a dartboard out there and hoping that it's not going to bite you later on, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I guess the other thing, because as you 100% know, getting a positively geared property is almost impossible right at the moment with interest rates. But for me, positively geared means having the overall portfolio positively geared over time. It doesn't mean going out and just chasing those really high cash flow positive properties in a hotspot as that one single property. Even for me, and I currently have about 19 properties in my portfolio. Overall, it's positively geared, but I've still got negatively geared properties within the portfolio, and then I've got others that are paid off that are obviously positively geared. So it's really about achieving that your goals over the long term and being really strategic about what properties you're buying and what the exit strategy is. How you're going to pay down that debt and everything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just by looking at the media saying this place is going to boom or these are the suburbs that are outperforming the market, I mean, I've had plenty of fun on podcasts in the past where, speaking to data analysts where we're looking at one of the property magazines saying this was the best performing market in Australia. And then you look at the price segmentation and it's a sort of place where, there's a waterfront with $5 million homes and then 2 streets back they're selling for $350, and it's just a makeup of, okay, well, a little bit extra waterfront sold in the last 12 months. So that's made the median go through the roof. And essentially you can throw the media in the bin as an indicator of movement of price in that particular market. So there's a little bit more to it than I think sometimes the media make out.
Oh, absolutely. And it's often clickbait as well because, people will just look at that and think, oh, next hotspot, how would you like to make, lots of equity in 6 months and build or buy, 10 properties in 10 weeks and all that kind of stuff. But it's not really what it's about. It's not what property investing is about, essentially.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
And I think you both touched on that too, and you touched on it with the veggies. A lot of investors don't seem to know why they're buying investment property. Their accountants told them to buy something, but they don't really have a long-term strategy to say, why have we bought that? And you cover that in your book, Lloyd, very well. Well, it's one of the things I think people need to look at to say, why are we buying that? And you seem to agree with that too.
Yeah. I think your end goal is the driving factor, and as I think Gary Vee likes to say, you need to reverse engineer the process to get to that end goal. And that end goal can be something like a passive income goal or a net asset value. But without that, I mean, you're chasing your way to a destination that you haven't actually defined. And I think that you're much less likely to hit whatever goal you set if you don't physically say, look, this is exactly where I want to be in this time frame. So it requires these strategic moves. It requires this sort of mortgage strategy, these types of properties for me to get there. I mean, the idea that you're just buying an investment property because, I don't know, it seems like a sensible idea, or my brother did it and he's got more money than me, or my accountant said I'm paying too much tax and everyone hates tax, so I'm going to buy a negatively geared property. I think these are some examples of why the majority of people still only own one property. And I think if your goal is to actually only ever own one investment property, then that's fine and all power to you. But I think the reality is that one property arguably is not going to be enough to set you up for the financial future that got you investing in property in the first place. So it really is all about strategizing, defining what you're trying to achieve, and then going back and saying, all right, well, what's step one on that roadmap?
Very good. Yeah. Very good advice, Mike. Very good advice. Well, Lloyd, I've got a bit of a surprise for you today.
Look, I love or hate surprises, whichever way you put it.
Well, one of our podcasts, we had Ed Cavaliero, and he came up with a great game. So we're going to call it Good Deal, Bad Deal by Ed Cavalier.
Okay.
So I've got 3 deals that I've picked out throughout the country, and I'd like to put them to Lloyd and just see what he thinks, if they're a good deal or bad deal. And Mike, I'd like to hear your comments as well. So are we ready to get started?
Okay, let's see what we can do.
Okay, so this one is in one of your old backyards, your old stomping ground. I've got a 3-bedroom townhouse / semi, 2 bathrooms, no parking. It was built in 2015. It is 29A Lewisham Street, Dully Chill. You might know that address. Probably got a rental return of around $1,300 a week. Guide price at the moment is 1.9.
I used to live around the corner from there.
You did.
That's actually that's been in the news lately.
Popular home.
That's
that's Albo.
That's the
right?
Prime Minister's house.
That is
it?
the Prime Minister's
Yeah.
house. Yes, it is. Right. So that's coming on the market. So do you think that's a good deal or a bad deal?
The property yourself, or because Aldo's selling it?
Well, maybe they're worth something together. I don't know.
That's
Can we put that in the quantity surveyor and see if we can get a discount on that too, because it was his home?
Well, maybe. Good deal, bad deal, obviously comes down to what we're just talking about, strategy. So that kind of property is going to be, firstly, a negatively geared asset, but it's also a blue chip asset, a good location. So for me, I think that would probably suit someone who's got a bit of coin, because if they're an investor, then they are going to have a little bit of money to invest there, probably a young couple or a young professional who can obviously hold something that's going to be negatively geared, because it's probably going to be close to the 2 mil, maybe 1.8 sort of mark.
That's what I sort of think too.
And if it's bringing you $1,300 a week, you're going to be losing a bit of money there. Good asset over time.
Yeah.
Could make a home for a young couple as
Albanese
well.
is making a good profit on it. I know that's what he bought it for in 2015, was 1,175. So he's making a good dollar on it.
You'll make a bit of money on
what
that.
did we decide? Was that a good deal or a bad deal?
I think that is a...
And do you think that's good for a first home buyer or investor?
Look, as an investor, it comes down to your budget and your goals. But I think as an investor, long term that'll be okay. As a first home buyer, it's on the upwards end of maybe a first home buyer budget in that area, but that's kind of where the price segment is. So I think it's good for either.
It's good for either. Mike, any comment on that one?
Look, I don't want to agree with Lloyd, so I don't want to disagree with Lloyd, I should say.
It's his show, so don't disagree
I won't,
too much.
But I also will a little bit. I mean, that's a blue chip property in a very sought after place around the country. So there's no argument to say that over time it will perform fairly well. But I'm actually in the newspaper today analysing that particular property for a journalist to figure out what the capital gains tax exemption would be for the PM.
No wonder
and
you knew
last
what
week
property
a
it was.
journalist asked me to model the depreciation deductions on it. I mean, over a 10-year period, it's grown from, what did you say, 1.17 to a price point of 1.9.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not a huge amount of growth at that point in time. And you know, I did model the negative gearing position, and we don't know whether he had a 10% loan or a 20% loan, but you know, it's going to be negatively geared to somewhere around 20 or 30K a year. So it just sort of depends. And going back to the vegetables and the dessert conversation, for a first investment property, unless you're on a very, very serious income, say 500K, 100K, a million or more, it's probably going to be the last thing that you'll be able to hold on to for quite some time. You really need that equity to grow, and it might take a little while for that to happen. So, I mean, that could be a really good maybe 4th or 5th investment property, or a first one if you're on $1 million a year. But so negatively geared, you'll be chipping into your pocket a couple of $100 a week. So it's probably an example of the type of property that maybe an investor will buy, and that will kind of hold them back from the growth. I'd much rather perhaps split that $1.92 million in two and look at, you know, two
the next one might help
lower
you then.
priced
The next
value
one might
ones.
help you. We've got 3 to look at. Here's
Yeah,
our
right.
next one. So we've got one in Tassie. This is in Tasmanian Highway, Waverley. It is a 3-bedroom cottage, weatherboard, 1 bathroom, 2 car spaces. Looks quite nice. Will rent in the low 4s. I'm just looking for the land size as well. I think it's just about 669 square meters, this one.
So I think for me, Tasmania is a little bit questionable in terms of long-term growth. Probably not enough infrastructure long-term. I know it had quite a lot of growth and a lot of hype around the years from about 2016 to 2018. It's dropped back since then. It's got a fairly decent yield, but there's also good yields in other areas around the country, WA and especially Queensland. For me, like the other thing about that, you've been a weatherboard. I think you probably buy a brick house for similar price in other areas, maybe Southeast Queensland. For me, it's probably a house I'd probably stay away from.
Okay, there you go. Mike, did you have any thoughts on that one? 395.
I love Tassie, beautiful part of the world, but a relatively sort of volatile housing market. And CoreLogic have recently come up with their got what would ostensibly be the September numbers, and the peak of the market in Hobart was March 2022, and we're actually down 12.5% from that peak. Now, we've seen obviously a huge boom in Hobart a number of years ago, and we saw a lot of people transact there, but we've actually seen rents increase quite rapidly in Hobart in the last little while compared to everywhere else, but it's from a very, very low base. So, I mean, it's certainly not at the peak of the market. It seems like there's probably only more upside than downside to come, but it's one of those markets that I get a little bit sort of nervous about. It doesn't seem to track to some of the similar capitals, but I mean, in a diversified portfolio, I've got plenty of time for places like Hobart, and I think it's a much more achievable price point and a cash flow position than Albo's property in Dulwich Hill. So look, I'm going to call that probably a neutral one. It's not bad or good from my perspective. Our last
one today, so I went onto realestate.com, looked for one of the cheapest properties in Australia. So I found one in Mount Isa, Queensland. It's a miners cottage. It's 160,000. I wouldn't call it a weatherboard. I'd probably call it a shack. It's got 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, but it's on 1,012 square meters. You might know a bit about this.
I know all about mining towns. I wrote about my property in Blackwater, not too far from Mount Isa. Obviously, very cheap property, but how much growth are we going to get there? We've seen a lot of growth, and I think a lot of people got swept up in the mining boom, particularly in the early 2000s, and probably to some extent, me included, because I bought a property for about 260,000 in Blackwater that was renting for about 800 a week. Luckily, I only bought one of them because some people bought about 10 of them and went bankrupt. But when the mining boom ended in the end of 2012, when the mining company moved out and a family moved in, they went from about 800 a week to about 190 a week overnight. That's the sort of property I'd stay clear from, this because at the end of the day, you need to get growth. There needs to be demand for your property, and to achieve your long-term goals, you need to actually to achieve wealth. You need to have growth. I don't believe there's going to be growth. If it's only 160,000 now, how much growth are we really going to get in there, no matter how big the land size is?
Good point. Mike, any thoughts?
I think if we could all invest retrospectively, places like Mount Isa would probably see a lot more transactions. If we knew that you could buy for, 200K and it's renting for 800, all right, we'll buy there and we'll sell there before the mining sort of closes its doors. But see, that's the thing, isn't it? You can't invest retrospectively, and you're at the mercy of some CFO looking at the resources price, and with a stroke of a pen shuts the whole thing down. I've spoken to a number of property people over the years, and many much more educated and adept than I am, and none of them have said that I confidently can predict, mining boom towns with enough certainty to actually invest in them. And that notion about the big land parcel, right? Well, that's only important if there is a land shortage. And I've never been to Mount Isa, but I just picture vast expanses of land. Yeah. So there's no scarcity value. If you're talking, 1,200 square meters in a capital city, like that's magic, right? But in Mount Isa, I kind of think, well, there's just land everywhere, so it doesn't have the same value to me. So I think, Amanda, that's an absolute shocker, and you should be sacked.
Yeah, what are you doing there?
Well, it's just to put Lloyd on the spot and to see if he's up to his credentials. He's written 2 books. So at the end of those 3, we sort of thinking the Prime Minister's done the best out of those 3. I think that's what we can conclude.
I agree with Mike on what he's saying about that, because I'd probably put my money on maybe a couple of properties. But having said that, my most recent investment property was one I bought in Brisbane, in Manly, and I paid about 1.5 for that because I've got a lot of investments. So not a first home buyer type property, but one if you've already got a few properties and you want to get a blue chip property, then that would be something to get. But certainly not as a first time investor. I'd do what Mike said, which is to buy a couple.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank you, Mike, for coming on. Really enjoyed it. Lloyd, good to see you again. Hope to see you soon.
It's been a hoot. Thanks, Amanda, and thanks very much, Mike. We've all gained a lot from your expertise and insights today. Thanks so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.